All right, so we are live and recording now. All right, what we're going to do today is that I'm just quickly going to go over, I'm going to go over the main changes of the dashboard, things that are important to note. As you can see here, there are quite some changes. Some you will see immediately, and some are a little bit more hidden. But there's some, like I already said in announcement message, the data itself is the same, but the interpretation of it is quite different. The main feedback we heard was that it was too complex to really come to conclusions. Everything was overwhelming, so there was basically just a lot of mental processing that needed to happen in order to turn the data into actionable insights, right? So from the process from data to decision making was quite cumbersome, and it was fair feedback. So what we really did is go back to the design table and say, okay, how are we actually using this? How are we actually applying this? And how can we minimize the friction between data and decision as much as possible? And that is what this is. So I want to go over that. First of all, what you will notice is that everything is a little bit cleaner and more simplified. We wanted to cut out the noise. We cut some things out. That's why we did the survey a while back, if you might remember, where we asked what people were using and what people were not using. And basically, we just said, okay, if it's not actionable, if it's not like really being used to take action on the charts, right, and in your TA, then it just has to go. And then, quite a lot had to go. So as you can see right now, what we're looking at is a quite simplified dashboard, and I'm just going to go over the things. First of all, you'll see here asset class. It's just crypto for now. The other assets are classes are coming, but we'll be releasing them in the coming weeks. Right, the backend connection is already done. Then we still have the same here with addition. Shout out to Pushi. I see you here for giving this suggestion. We can now look for assets, and we can type it. So that's actually really nice. So that's a cleaner UX. We have now the calculation period where you can just select the last 2 years, the last 1 year. By the way, the biggest thing is this, by the way, on the right, the key insights. But I'm going to get to that, right? This is the most important change we made. But so here, for example, now you can just select the last 1 year, which is nicer because you don't have to constantly move the slider to the right. Then the filter settings. So this is also, I know some people, sometimes when they're trading the weeks, they would have Mondays to Fridays selected. And then in the weekends, they would have Saturdays to Sundays selected. But then in the week, they forgot to put it back and then you have the wrong statistics. So what this is doing, basically, you can choose that if you have manual selected, then you can see here, you can just select the weekdays you want to filter the data for. However, if you have auto weekdays, weekends selected, then what it does is that it automatically selects the Mondays to Fridays if the current day is weekday. So today's Tuesday, so now this is filtered on Mondays to Fridays. If it would be a Saturday today, then it's going to look at Saturdays, Sundays. And you could also choose, for example, to look at the current day. In this case, you would look at only Tuesdays and it would gather statistics for that, right? So you can see that now actually it's quite a big difference on Tuesdays. So I usually use this one. So this is just a little bit more UX friendly. And then the candle selection, it is not relevant for the daily time frame, but it is relevant for session, for our hourly time frame. What basically this means, current candle, for example, on the hourly time frame, it selects the current hour, and then you don't have to manually switch all the time, right? So this is pretty self-explanatory, just a little bit cleaner UX, but not the main thing we're here for. Obviously, we're here for the different statistics and stuff that we've integrated, so I want to have a look into that. This part you already know, right? It's pretty much the same as what we had. Removed the recent change. The reason is because it's not that actionable, right? It's not very actionable. I will probably integrate it back into some like other view, but for this screen, I removed it because you couldn't really take any action on it. This is pretty much the data that's being used most often. And then here on the right, we see the key insights. Maybe good to note, this is just the navigation, right? But it's pretty self-explanatory. And here we can switch time frames. So we see that, now it actually changes a lot quicker as well. If you switch time frames like this, it's a lot more easier to load. And we have a new one. We have the monthly, pretty cool. That's also why I have this warning right here. Obviously, for the monthly, you have less data. For Bitcoin, you actually have quite some data, but you have to set it like, to less than years. And here you can see how much data is being presented, right? So it will give you a warning if there's not a lot of data, like you saw, just now. So there's actually, you can now look at weekly data, for example, for all assets, but if there's not a lot of data, I will just show you here that there's not a lot of data and you have to be careful. But, the monthly, I will let you just fool around with that in your own free time, because I'm sure you will figure it out. The main thing I want to talk right now is here. I want to go over the key insights. So the most important part of any page right now, this is going to be like kind of the new template we're having, where this is Data Explorer, and here we have the key insights, and then here on the bottom right, we see a summary for the current day for Bitcoin, US dollars, because we have Bitcoin selected. And I'm going to go, the most important one is here, but I'm going to go over this one from top to bottom. So here, obviously, we have just daily lows at midnight 15, daily high at 145. First of all, what we see here is how many P1s are formed at or before the current P1, right? So 0015. As Frost, shout out to Frost, already noted in the general chat, is that this is now more granular. This is based on 5-minute data. So you see me a couple of times predict that a P1 flip was going to happen using this feature, as you will now figure out. But what this is basically saying is just really looking on a 5-minute granularity. Okay, so the current P1 was formed at 0015, right? So not at, just like 50 minutes past 12. And then checks, okay, how many P1s have usually been formed by that? And in this case, it is 15.3%, right? Because you have to understand that this hour zero is something we have discussed or looked at for a long time, as the hourly granularity. But what we're doing now is that we're going to look a lot more granular, as in we're going to look at the 5-minute time frame instead of the hourly time frame, because it can give us more data. Now, there's a little bit of a thinking switch here that we made. I really reflected a lot on how we're using this, and this is something that I think actually makes a lot of sense. So let me explain this. So if we have, for example, here, we have P1s formed at or before 0015, 15.3%. That means that, and that's the first one here you see in the summary, the daily low, P1, is at an unlikely time because 84.7% of P1s form after 15 past midnight, right? So we have now that P1 at the start of the daily open, more or less. And what we can see is that 84.7% of the time, the day puts in a P1 later than 0015. So what this is saying, immediately indicating, is that, actually this is an unlikely low or unlikely P1. And this is where things get, is the mindset shift that comes in, because you might say, okay, but hour zero is a high probability pivot. Well, yes and no. It is a high frequency, high density pivot, right? But even if you have 28% of P1s in hour zero, then you still have more than 70% of P1s later on in the day. So the highest probability is actually to put in P1 later than hour zero. There are other, like at some point it becomes higher probability. That is what we use the second one for. We'll get into that. But this is a very good distinction to make, right? High density does not equal high probability. We have like, how do you call it? A left curved distribution. So this is something we can use to our advantage, because we do know that every day starts at hour zero and ends at, midnight the next day. And it moves sequentially from the start of the day to the end of the day, right? It's linearly. So we can just at any point in time ask ourselves, if P1 is put in, okay, how likely is that P1 to be put in by this time? This is basically what you're asking, right? Daily low is at an unlikely time because it says 84.7% of P1s form after a quarter past midnight, right? So it does happen. We know that it can happen, right? And 15% of the times it happens, but it just doesn't happen a lot, because very simply put, 85% of the time it happens later. And this is one of those metrics that is new, and it's the same data, just more granular in another way of looking at it. And this will help us a lot with preventing P1, P2 flips. Now, before I move on to the other ones, I just want to make this clear by going to the weekly and looking at the same thing. So what we have, for example, now On the weekly, we have the weekly P1 on Monday 0000, right at midnight, and we can see that that's an unlikely time as well because almost 90% of P1s form after Monday midnight. So this is also one of the things, before this we just had, okay, we knew that Mondays were going to put in a P1 or a P2. I think with the weekly I would use a little bit more. So see, this is nice because now I have 1 year selected. This is immediately telling me, oh, I'm using 52 data points. Insight maybe less reliable, and crank it up a bit. So before this, we only knew, Monday P1, it happens like 63% of the time. But if you have the Monday P1 and a Monday P2, then, you cannot really say much. But now we can. Because here, once again, we see that actually, it's actually still quite a bit, because this is on the 30-minute granularity. The weekly looks at the 30-minute granularity. The daily and below looks at 5-minute granularity. So in the first half an hour, basically it's saying that 13.5% of weekly P1s get formed in the first half an hour of the week, which is actually quite a lot. It's still a minority, don't get me wrong, but I find it still quite a bit. But so what we see now is here the same thing. Weekly low P1 is an unlikely time because 86.5% of P1s form after Monday 0000. So in this case, we have that Monday P1, and by the way, we just took out the daily low, I think. Almost. We're almost gonna take it out, which would not be weird because we were. I'm looking at this is the. Or is that the previous one? Let me just check this one. All right. Oh no, we did take it out. We did take it out. So we took out the daily low. So this is going to change now. So see, this is what I actually perfect live example. The trading got blessed with a live example. So that daily low was an unlikely time because 85.6% of P1s form after 15 minutes past midnight, and we literally just took it out, right? Because it was right here, right? See, 15 past midnight. You can see it here. 15 past midnight. And we now took it out, just took it out. Let me get the session thing off. So we just took it out. And the reason, so normally this would have been a pretty good setup for a continuation trade, right? And it would still, we still have the other statistics as well. But in this case, you would be a lot more cautious because you would see that, well, this was an unlikely time because 85% of days, which is really a lot, form a P1 later than 0015, right? So it's actually really not that common to put in a P1 very, very early in the day, in the first 50 minutes. And as you will see, the first 5 minutes is only like, I don't know, 5%, 6%, something like that. You will see it. So now we took it out. So this is a really nice warning for if P1 gets, or if there's what the risk is for potential P1, P2 flip, right? So in this case, we just took it out. So this will probably update pretty soon, in a couple of minutes, and then this will change, and because we have a new P1, right? So I hope that's clear on what this metric is. If it's not, please let me know. Any questions, guys, just drop them in the chat and now's the time to ask them. If not, I understand also there needs to be some processing after this. So Thursday, there's another stream for that very reason. So you can ask any questions if you've used it for a couple of days. But this was a nice use case of this statistic. So let's move on to the next one. So this is pretty much just very clear, showing, okay, how many P1s are put in later than the current P1. So this was the current P1, now taken out. And then we look at, okay, the percent of P1s formed at or after 145, which was the current P2. And we see that 15.5% of days flip P1. So what this means is that if we look at where the current P2 is, which is 1345, we can just take a look at, okay, how many P1s are put in after 145. Because we know, as just happened, for this to become P1, we need to take out the existing P1, the P1, P2 flip. And what we're asking is basically, how often does that happen after this time? Because we know that this is now, this was the P2. So we know that if it were to happen, it will happen from here or later, right? So basically, the further you get in the day, the lower that or the further you get in the day and the more P2s you set in, the lower that probability will get. So in this case, and this is why it's nice, the risk was low, right? Because only 15.5% of they flip P1 at hour 1 or at 1:45 p.m. or later. But that's why this is so nice in Confluence. And by the way, before I explain this, I want you to see all these three as different metrics, right? Because one of the confusions that can come into mind, okay, but how can this be an unlikely time? How can this be a low P1, P2 flip risk? You know, don't they say the opposite things? The reason is all these three metrics are standalone metrics by themselves, and they explain different things. They are not inherently related to each other. They do not influence each other. They're just standalone metrics. And just like we do with the A, you stack different confluence on top of each other and you use them in congruence with each other. So there you go. And now it flipped, right? And now it flipped, and now we know that it will likely hold because only 14.8% of P1s form after 1:45. All right, too bad it kind of flipped because I was, right in the middle of explaining that, but still very cool to see that live in playing out exactly very nicely. And then this is just looking at, okay, how, in this case now it's looking at, we have P2 at 6:15, so it looks at how many flips happen after 6:15 and 0.4%. So in this case, obviously now it's late in the day, these statistics will be much more actionable in the middle of the day. But you know what this means is that there's pretty much a 0.4% chance of flipping P1. So what we see now very quickly in 3 seconds is that, okay, the daily high will likely hold because it's very rare that P1 is formed later, and there's also very low P1 P2 flip risk. But to circle back on what I was discussing, where this was a low probability hold and this was a low probability to flip, then once again you're using that in confluence with each other, right? So yes, you had a low risk to flip that we just had, right? 50 minutes. I think I actually made a screenshot of this before it happened. All right, let me get that back on. Why can't I get that back on? Right, let me get that back on if I can. All right, so I just want to get this point across. So in this case, we had a low flip risk, but also an improbable time. So in this case, normally speaking, yes, you wouldn't expect it to flip anymore, but if it was ever going to happen, now would have been a good time, right? That's how you have to read it. So yes, this is still like a 15% event or a 16% event. So what just happened is not a very likely event. But if it's ever going to happen, it makes sense to do it from this kind of place, right? Because you already know that 85% of P1s form after midnight 15. So once again, don't see these as, that they have to be the same. They don't. They're not inherently related. They do not influence each other, and we shouldn't see them as such. So I hope that part makes sense. And in this case, now we know, okay, both of them are probably, now both of them are in confluence, right? Now this one is saying, okay, the high will likely hold, and this one is saying that it's also saying that the high will likely hold because the statistics are now in alignment. And then we have the last one. There we go here. We basically, this is the most important one. It just looks at, okay, how many P2 form after the current P2. So 6:15, we know we have the 6:15 P2. We see that 53% of P2s put in, or days put in a P2 at or after that time. So in this case, there's obviously 53% is no clear bias. And therefore it's saying, unclear if P2 is in, 53% of days form a new P2 after 6:15. So in this case, it is basically a point flip. I probably, by the way, use last 1 year for daily. I think that's what I'm going to use. But what you saw earlier, by the way, and I can show you that one more time, is that here, in this case, it was unlikely that P2 was in, right? So until we just broke it, because 90% of days form a new P2 after 1:45. So if we summarize this one, we had the daily low at a very unlikely time, right? We had a low P1, P2 flip risk, but we take into account that if it was ever going to happen, this would be a good time to do it. And we also know that it was unlikely to put P2 in because 89.3% of days form a new P2 after 1:45. So if you take these two together, then you would say, okay, this is an unlikely P1. It's also unlikely P2 is in. So that means that the flip risk is quite high. And what made it even more clear was the session statistics, which I luckily saved and I'm going to get into. But I hope this makes sense. This is the new time page. The time page is actually going to be a lot more actionable. You might be wondering, where did time adjusted filtering go? Well, that one went out of the door because this is, in my opinion, the better solution, more accurate and more objective as well. And this is going to give us better results. So this is more or less new time adjusted filtering. All right, so I hope that part makes sense. And I don't see any questions, so I guess it does. So without further ado, let me go into the next page, which also changed a little bit. This one is more towards what it was. So this one you already know, it's quite intuitive as well. So this chart, we know the frequency distribution of distance between the open and the P1. We can see that the current high is currently here and the current low is here. And well, this is actually an uncommon place for P1. So what we do here, and I think I didn't, did I save that screenshot? Because that one was actually also pretty nice. Unfortunately, I didn't. I do think I might have it somewhere else. But what this is, let me just go over this one by one. So first of all, we have, oh, I forgot to put the titles back on. So there should be titles here. I'll fix that. I have it hidden. But what this is saying is the P1 status, P2 status. So I'll fix that after this stream, that they're back. What this is saying, okay, the percentage of P1s formed above the open by more than 2.2%, so the high, in this case 13.4%. So this means the high is currently, we see that here, is P1, it's formed 2.2% above the daily open. This was P2 until recently, right? This was P2 until recently. Now, where this metric is really going to come in is that if this is high, and that was the case as well just now, if this is high, that means it's kind of like this here is exactly the same as what we did with the time statistics, only we're doing it with the distance statistics. In this case, this is looking at the current P1, right? So the current P1 is 2.2% above the daily open. How many P1s are put in further than that? Only 13.4%. So, you know, you cannot say that this is a very, how do you say it? Very improbable. The reason why I'm saying that, and I can actually just show you this one here, because I actually already screenshotted this, and this is a new page that you're gonna look at later, but I want you to focus on only the top part here. So here you saw insight for the current day from a little bit earlier. So this was time statistics, right, that we saw. The daily P1 was at an unlikely time, because 84.7% of P1s formed after midnight 15. Similarly, the daily low was at an unlikely place, right? So it's saying is P1 at logical time place, because 80% of P1s formed further from the daily open. So what this is looking at, this metric is here. So we have the daily open here, here, and it went down this much. And then basically what that metric was saying is that, well, more than 80% of the time, price actually forms a P1 further from the daily open. So this also is an unlikely place to put in a P1. So once again, this is another metric that will help us greatly in determining, okay, how likely is that P1 flip going to happen? Because we can statistically see that price is more likely to do this rather than this, right? This we now know is better, and we know exactly how much better, because we can see it by these. So in this case, is the higher it is, and I know this might be a little bit confusing, so bear with me. The higher this is, the better, right? The higher this value is, or sorry, I'm not saying that right. The lower this value is, the better. The lower this value is, the more confident you can be that P1 will hold. Because if it's low, if this is very high, as was the case here. Oh, where did it go? As was the case here, right? 81%. Then we know that 80% of the days would take out that P1 more or less, because 80% of the days put in a P1 further from the daily open than what we currently had, right? So we know now that we want to have some distance. And this kind of brings me to the same point as what I made with the time statistics, is that this, a lot of the P1s happen around the daily open. It's high frequency, but it's not high probability, because even if you have 30% of the observations here that still leaves 70% of the observations, having a P1 further from the daily open, right? So this is once again a very good way of checking. Okay, so if this one is very high, so say it's 95%, then you know that 95% of days put in a P1 further than what we've currently done. So it is much more likely to form a P1 P2 flip than if this was lower. In this case, it could hold because we've already went quite far. So high value for this, and this is not a metric we were actively using. It was actually available, we're not actively using it, but a high value of this means a much higher probability for a P1 P2 flip. But it will become very clear because this will basically just tell you whether you're at risk or not, because just like here, it's just telling you, hey, it's at an unlikely place, 80% of P1s form further, right? So I think it will make sense. Then we go to the next one. Here we see the percentage of P2s that reached 0.5% below the daily open. So that's now the P2, right? 0.5% below the daily open. We see, 100% of days. Basically what this is saying, like how many days have a daily low that is 0.5% below the daily open or lower. In this case, 100%. All days, apparently here from the last 1 year at least, have a P2 that reaches 0.5% below the daily open or lower. Of those lows, how many became P1 after reaching the level? 36.2%. Obviously, this is now much lower probability to flip P1 because we're much further in the day. The P1 is very high. You have to take these into account. But in general, you might recognize this from what basically this is here. You see here 36.2%. Here translate as moderate P1, P2 flip risk. So what this is doing, what we did before, as you might remember, is that we looked at, okay, where is the current P2 and what is, like, how often do we get a P1 from that distance? What we're doing now is that this metric is a little bit more accurate. I polished it a little bit because what it's doing now, it is looking at, okay, how many P2s actually reach this far below the daily open and how many of those became P1 after that, right? So in this case, it is really asking the question, and in this case, by the way, it made less sense because we're very close to daily open. But let's say we just had this situation still. What it's basically saying is, okay, price moves up here with 2.6%. What it's basically saying is, okay, how many days actually have a high that is 2.6% above the daily open or higher, and how many of those days actually flip? So what this metric is doing is that this metric is actually a more conservative and more accurate metric of the ones we were using. So you will see that compared to if you would compare them, the old dashboard would give like a lower percentage. But this one is a little bit more conservative, but it's also more accurate because we're actually, we're just, instead of saying, okay, how often do we flip after moving 3% above the high, or just saying how often do we have a P1 of 3% above the high, what we're doing is like, okay, how many days do we have with a P1 or P2, right? Just the high that's 3% above the high, and how many of those are the P1, right? Because we know that any P1 starts as a P2, right? Because for this to become P1, we need the flip. So what this metric is just asking, how many times does price get here and then does this? That's what this metric is asking. So once again, we have that P1, P2 flip risk. In this case, this one you already know. We just look at, okay, what's the total displacement now for the day between P1, P2? We see it right here. In this case, we go from the high to the low. And we see that it's unlikely that P2 is in because 88% of days moved further than negative 2.7%. So you can see that this format is the same as the time statistics. We're basically answering the same questions, which brings me to the next page, which is the summary page is no longer the summary page, that is now the overview page. The summary page is now my new one of my new favorite pages, and that is, it brings all this data that we just looked at together into one simple overview. And what you can do is that you can select different time frames. So for example, I can select the weekly time frame, I can select the daily time frame, and what it is now doing is that the statistics that I just discussed, the key insights that I just discussed of the time statistics space and the distance statistics space are now shown to you on this page right here. So here we have summary view 1, key insights on the current week for Bitcoin US dollar. So here we can immediately see that the weekly low, so we do the same thing, is actually at an unlikely time because 87.5% of P1s form after Monday, and it's also in an unlikely place. Look at this, 99%. Oh, Omniscience, please mute yourself, my friend. Mute yourself. I'll mute you. There you go. And the weekly low is actually an unlikely trade because 99% of P1s form further from weekly open. And here you can see how valuable this becomes, right? Because if we have the weekly P1, what we had first is, you have a moderate P1, P2 flip risk for the week because only 30% of weeks flip P1. In reality, the old dashboard would have given an even lower percentage for this. But look at this. This is like a warning sign, right? So if we go to the this one, the weekly, oh, there's some nice examples actually going on live to explain everything properly, so that's nice. So here we have this weekly P1 really close to the weekly open, right? This is the weekly open right here, and the weekly P1 right below it. And we know it's very, very close because 99% of P1s form further from the weekly open. So for this thing to hold would actually be a 1% probability. And by the way, this is showing you here a little bit a nudge whether you have enough data. In this case, there's enough data, so that's good. So what do you can take away from this? Well, immediately, I mean, it's an unlikely time because, almost 90% of P1s form later and 99% of P1s form further from weekly open. So if you think about this a little bit, what this is pretty much doing is that this can be used for wickless candles, right? So we know that candles without a wick often get revisited pretty fast. Well, this is pretty much what you will see. If you have no wick, you will see this is very, very high. But in this case, we have a moderate P1, P2 flip risk, right? Moderately low. But if it's the same as what I discussed with the daily, if it was ever going to happen, now is the time, right? Because it's the weekly P1 is an unlikely time and it's in an unlikely place. So, this is targeted. So if you saw me do that last week, I wrote a post where I said, okay, I think we're probably going to take out the weekly P1, which was, I don't know, somewhere here, this one. That was the same thing, right? Because if you looked at the weekly P1 here, then it was a very, very, very unlikely P1 because 80% of P1s form later. And that is, what happens. So this makes a lot of sense. You have to think that these weekly P1s, the daily P1s that happen very early and very close, they are the ones, they usually stay intact if you're like in a trending environment, right? But most of the time, price is not trending, price is ranging. So, it actually makes a lot of sense that the statistics are saying that, but it makes a lot of sense that these get taken out more often than not. So then the second one, what's the risk of P1, P2 flip? We see for the time statistic summary, same thing, right? So this is looking just at the P1, P2 flip risk based on the time statistics. So the one we just discussed. So it looks at, okay, current P2 is at, in this case, Tuesday something. How many times do we flip P1 after, Tuesday or later? Or Tuesday, I don't know what time the P2 was put in, but it looks at 30-minute granularity. And this one looks at the distance, right? So, okay, we now, what this one is saying, price moved up this far above weekly open. How many weeks actually have a weekly high this far above the weekly open? And how many of those do this, right? And that is 30%, okay? And then finally, we know that with a very strong probability that, the weekly low or the weekly P2 is not in, 94% of weeks form a new P2 later than Tuesday 1:30, and 100% of weeks see move further than 3.4%. Doesn't mean there's 100% chance, as you know, but that does indicate that there's a very high probability. And since this is indicating that most likely it's not going to be the low that holds the P1, for now at least you're targeting that weekly P1, right? Because of these. So I hope you see how much simpler it is now to come to a conclusion on the dashboard. You look at here, you just see like, well, is P1 at logical time and place? Nope, not at all. So immediately that P1 is at risk of being taken out. Well, it happens 30% of the time, and it's also very, very likely that the P2 is not in yet, right? And you can do that for week and day together and other. What I have here is my bookmarks. Oh, they got deleted. Oh no, they're not deleted. I had my bookmarks on the other the beta version. So what you can, for example, do here is what I can do is summary and then weekly plus daily. Save. But for the same, like things on lower time frames are going to get much more interesting to use because, for example, the 4 hour, not a lot of people were using it for good reason. But if you go now, for example, on the 4 hour and the hourly, even those are much more easier to process now, right? Because we have this data, this summary page, just showing us what's up, showing us how to do it. So, here immediately, well, I mean, so 4 hour high could hold, unlikely place, but 72% is not 99% like we just saw. There's low flip risk. So immediately if I see this, I'm like, okay, the 4 hour high will most likely hold, and we'll probably go down a little bit lower, right? So that's what I'm gonna get away from here. And here there's more or less even also. But for example, one of my favorite ones is to use the daily with the session. Especially during the New York session, and that's what I made the screenshot for this afternoon, because I already figured we were gonna take out and this is how you see how powerful this is. I already figured we were gonna take out the daily low because of this combination, and this is what I hinted at earlier. Let me get this one back on to a helper. Right, so this was a while back. Let me get this one off, this one off. I want to show daily and I want to show the session. I don't want to show the weekly right now. All right, so what we had earlier, right, we had the New York Open here. This is where I made the screenshot. And what you could see then is that here we had, so now everything will make sense. We immediately saw that the daily low was an unlikely time and an unlikely place, right? So that was the old daily low, this one right here. Let me mark that out. So you immediately know, okay, that one's targeted. And this was already, you could already see that here as well, right? That statistic would be the same here at the top. So I already see, okay, that's a shitty low. Then, well, we discussed this one, right? Yes, it doesn't happen that often from a P1 flip from hour 13 or later, but if it ever happens, then this would be a good time to do it. And we could see that it's very unlikely P2 is in. And then the interesting part comes with the session below it, where you can see, well, the session high was pretty good, right? Because 50% of P1s form after, so it's more or less, it's not very unlikely. It's not a high metric like this. Same here, right? The session high was actually put in pretty high. And there is a low P1, P2 flip risk, right? So both these are indicating there's not a direct danger of P1 being taken out because it's not put in a very unlikely, not unreasonably close to the open. There is a low P1, P2 flip risk because only 5.7% of sessions flipped P1 after, from 350. And we could also see that 80% of sessions form a new P2 and 83% of sessions move further than 2.1%, which it had moved so far. So what this is showing, without very convincingly, is that the session high was likely in, right? Because of this one in combination with this one, and that the session P2 was likely not in. And since we know that session P1 is in, that you're likely not going to take it out, you're going to go lower, right? Because in this case, you have both confluences. Is that the daily high was shit, as we knew, and we also knew that by this time, very unlikely to go higher on the session, and very unlikely to not do anything because of this. Therefore, lower makes sense. All right, so I hope that one makes sense. A funny one that'll be interesting, will be the Uber here, the monthly and the weekly. If you use the monthly, man, use a shit ton of data. Just go. There's like 6 years of data, but just put it high. Weekly, whatever. So this one's going to be interesting, but once again, I will leave you to using the monthly. Obviously, there's few assets that have enough data to actively use this, but it is there now. So shout out to Pilot Mid. See you there. What's up, buddy? You wanted this one, I know, and here it is, man. I hope you will like it. So here you can do the same thing, and then on a monthly, pretty cool. But you can see here now a little warning: the distance stats are based on very limited data, so interpret distance-based insights with extreme caution. And the reason why distance stats use less data than time stats is because we look at the distance from the daily open and P1 and the daily open and P2, or where the distance of daily open to P1, we separate when the P1 is the high and when P1 is the low. So effectively, we have 2 times as little data points for the monthly, right? That's why. But still very interesting to look at it. Let's see. I haven't really used this yet, but it will be very, very interesting. We can, at least be sure that P2 is not in yet for the month of April. So yeah, I hope you guys will like that. All right, those are the most important changes. Then we're gonna move on to the overview page, which was the summary page. It's now just called the overview page because we now have a summary page that is, really for a single asset. So the overview page, it's a little slower now because I made some changes. So I'm gonna actually throw in some optimizations that will make it a little bit faster again. Actually, let me use one here. It's fine. All right, this one's the same thing. In the future, you'll be able to select multiple asset classes at the same time, because I can imagine it will be interesting to look at, for example, what the S&P 500 is doing and Bitcoin. Other than that, it's still the same thing. Something you will see different is that here you can select the minimum number of data points. So if you select here 50, what this is doing is actually filtering out all assets that have less than 50 data points. So for example, looking at days in this case, and it will filter out assets that have less than 50 days. In this case, you see there's 130 data points being used here for distance statistics, 261 here. So obviously this is fine. Here we see one SUSDT with only 64 days with a little exclamation mark. So okay, maybe you want to be careful with this one, right? Well, what's up, trading? Yep. What's up, yep. So this one you want to be careful with. But now what that means is that you can now actually see weekly statistics here as well for all the assets that you would want, because you can just select yourself the minimum number of data points you will want to see. So for example, now you see nothing here. The reason for that is that we have only one here selected, and this is not yielding us enough data points. So it's just filtering it out, right? So you can, and this will still allow you to view anything you want. You can even see the monthly in here if you would want to. The only thing is that you have to do is set this low, and then you can use it on your own, with your own caution. Obviously, I would advise making sure there are plenty of data points if you want to make any decisions based on that. But it is possible. So here, for example, there's an exclamation mark that it's not that many data points, right? But this is still, this is okay to do. You could do it. All right. So then what you see here, see, it's much more intensive. I will fix this. I didn't have time to do it, but if you see this, just use a little bit. Don't use all, because it's also because we have so many assets now. So just don't use all the assets, and then it will definitely work. But what you see here is just asset. We see the direction. Let me actually do that now for a bit, just because I'm explaining things. And then I'll see how much I can optimize that bad boy. So we see the asset, we see the direction. The percentage of P1s, let me actually get this one. The percentage of P1s further is, let me get this one out again. Where is it? There you go. All right, so our image disappeared. Then I will just do it like this. Oh, I'm on the wrong time frame. That's why. That's why it's not giving me any results. All right. So the percent of P1s further is this metric. Only then for distance. So the first one, I'm looking at the, forget that it's time, right? It's the first metric, that is this 1% of P1s later, actually. So what this is showing, right, is what we already knew. We're looking at, well, this is the weekly time frame, it's now loading the daily. It's just showing, okay, 88.5% of weeks, in this case, 14.9% of days put in a P1 later than 145. If this is high, you want to watch out for a P1, P2 flip, that's why it's there. And the other ones, P1 flip risk is this one, right? Simply this one. And the percentage of P2s put in later is this one, right? Then here, it's the same thing only for distance, right? It's the same thing only for distance. Percentage of P1s further is the first metric of the distance statistics. P1 flip risk is the second metric of the distance statistics. And the percentage with more distance is the third metric of the distance statistics. And we see here what current retracement is. This is still the same. And here you just see how many data points you're looking at. And when there's a check mark, things are good. Then we have the pivot zones, nothing changed. So, just the same old. The MTF overview is actually still a little bit of work in progress. What you can do here is now you can select your time frames. Also because this thing became so big that it's very difficult to load the whole thing. So you should use probably 4 or less, in my opinion. I also made it that way that you actually cannot select more. The monthly is not available yet. I might still do that, actually, because I do have the safeguard in there now. And here's just the same thing. You have to select your minimum amount of data points. If you select all assets and all time frames, you're probably gonna run into the same issue where you have like a query resource thing. So probably don't do that. Probably stick with your time frames of choice. You probably don't need all of them anyway. I mean, you're probably most, if you're day trading, you're probably most interested in the weekly, daily session at most, right? So just keep that in mind. Once again, I will dive into the code and try to optimize it so that it still loads faster, because I do want it a little bit faster. But here's the same thing. If you select this minimum number of data points, for example, if I would do 200, then I'm guessing this will just say insufficient data if there isn't enough. So now you can choose for yourself what is enough data points for you. I would definitely not put it any lower than 50. In this case, the current week is showing insufficient data because you only have 1 year. But this will nicely prevent you from using any making any decisions based on data that is just not very reliable. So in this case, if I set it to 2 years, you can see now we do have data for this right here. And this is obviously still the same as before. It's just using the other metric, the updated metric I use for the distance statistics, right? So this one, the second one right here, this one now. So it's a little bit, it will probably be a little bit more accurate. And the other one is still the same as here. I will probably change that page a little bit more because now that the time statistics are so much more actionable, I actually want to create functionalities that you can use time statistics as well if you want to get the same thing. So be on the lookout for that. Yeah, so this is all I had really to explain about it. I hope you can see that it's much more intuitive, and I hope it comes across that it's much easier to use now in your trading. And it's actually really fun to just look at the statistics develop over the day, right? Because now we just really looked at, okay, how are we actually using this at practice? For example, Yip is really using a lot the session statistics because the session statistics really show for New York. You can just go here and they show for New York very, very, very clearly that, P1 is put in, I think 80% of the time before hour 3, right? So that is what this is showing, right? This time statistic is now showing, well, now it's already very late, but it will show you, even if you have, that's what we had earlier, a P2 at 3 something, you will see, well, there's pretty much a negligible chance to put in a P1 from there, right? So we really looked at, okay, how are we using this? How are we using this in action? And then we formed these key insights. So what you're probably going to see is that the thing you use most is a summary on the bottom right. Now there will probably be, well, there will definitely be still some changes, some additions, some tweaks. But I wanted to release this. We had the deadline for today, and it's more than good enough to release. Once again, I really hope you see that this is going to be much more actionable, much easier to use, much more intuitive. If that's not the case, we would also love to hear it. The tutorials will be following within a couple of weeks. In the place for that, we're going to do a lot of live streams. I promise you I will be back with live streams. But I really wanted to get this done first because I was using this on the background, and in my streams I was using the old dashboard, and I was like, man, the old dashboard is shit when I was using this. So I really wanted to get this one out as soon as possible because then I can just stream with what I have at my disposal, and everyone can use it, and actually things will become relevant again. But the tutorials will still be coming. We're actually going to create the whole new Brighter Academy, as we call it. We really want to, just create a very good learning experience. But for now, this video for today will have to do. I would suggest, I can imagine that you first want to try it out a little bit, use it. So use it tomorrow, use it Thursday, and then on Thursday we have another stream where I'll just be doing a regular live stream. I will just be using the dashboard. So come to that stream if you have any questions. Obviously, before that, you can always ask questions in the Discord. And within a couple of weeks, we will start making the tutorials and really format that in a nice way that it becomes much more easier. So also, the tutorials will become much shorter. Where we first needed, 1.5 hours just to explain the time page. Now we need a lot less time to do it, right? Because that's the whole point of this. The easier it is to interpret the data, the more easy everything else becomes. So I think I'm gonna leave it at that. I really hope I pressed record properly. Otherwise, you guys will have to show it to anyone else. Let me quickly go in the chat to see